Hello, my name is Evan Perkins, and I'm the Assistant Director here at Gallery Kayafas. We're excited to share this interview today with gallery artist Peter Kayafas as the first in a series of artist talks that will continue throughout the remainder of the year. Peter's current body of work, The Way West, is on display at the gallery through August 23rd. It is accompanied by a monograph titled Peter Kayafas, The Way West, published by Purple Martin Press, which is also available for viewing and purchase at the gallery. For the past decade, Peter Kayafas has spent his summers driving around and photographing in the western United States, encompassing Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Colorado. Kayafas uses his camera to investigate the histories and ritualized traditions of the people from the West, as well as their intimate connection with the land and animals. Images of rodeos, state fairs, carnivals, and various other gathering places reveal young people in their shared and individual passages into adulthood. Though not limited to adolescence, these spaces act as a place of intergenerational community, fostering relationships and bonds centered around the land and animals of the rural western United States. Peter Kayafas is a photographer, publisher, curator, and teacher who lives in New York City, where he sits as the director of Aiken's Press Foundation and the co-chair of the board of directors of the Corporation of Yaddo. He's a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow, and his photographs have been widely exhibited and are in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the New York Public Library, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, the DeCordova Sculpture Park and Museum, and the Art Institute of Chicago, among others. He's taught photography at Pratt Institute since 2000. In addition to The Way West, Purple Martin Press has published 3 other monographs of Kayafas' work: The Merry Cemetery of Sapunta, O Public Road, Photographs of America, and Totems. Peter, thank you for joining us today.
Wow, thanks, Evan. That's a nice introduction. It's always a little hard to hear one's own stats, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be on your baseball card if we had one.
You might need two baseball cards for that long text, but anyway, I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad that the show is at the gallery, and thanks for the plug for the book, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's interesting to be able to see both your work on the wall exhibited and, people coming in are able to see that as well as go through the book in its entirety. I think that there are differences between the ways you present work, whether it's on the wall or in a book, and I think it's nice to be able to see both of those in tandem.
Yeah. Or in this case, Zoom.
Yes, yeah, exactly, or on a screen. So starting off, I wanted to ask you how you initially came across these communities and what drew you into wanting to photograph them. What interests did you have, and maybe how have they changed due to the fact that you've been photographing them for a decade now? And maybe did you have any preconceived ideas or notions of what these events would be like, whether, the events themselves or how your experience would be in these communities?
Yeah. Well, I've been making photographs on the roads of the United States since the year 1990. So that's been my MO. I mean, I live in New York City and I have a busy, responsibility-laden life here, running a press and teaching and being on various boards. So my core of my work done in a given year is typically during the summer, where I take a month and I travel. In the early stages of those trips in the 90s, it was mostly in the South, the Deep South and Southwest. And gradually I've sort of moved from region to region in what feels like an organic way, which is to say, curiosities about the South and its literature and what it looked like gradually evolved and spread west, much like the Great Migration did. And the last 10 years, as you mentioned, except for last year, but for a little over a decade, my focus has been on what I refer to as the Plains states, although also some of the work is a little bit further south and a little bit further west than what's typically thought of as the Plains. I guess there was a time when I was first driving back and forth across country, and I sort of zipped through Wyoming and Montana, and especially Nebraska. Nebraska has the appearance of being sort of homogeneous and plain and flat. Nothing could be further from the truth once one allows oneself to see things. And I think that's the case probably with most things. At a certain point, one's eyes are ready to see things, and then they start to appear. They've probably always been there in some form or another, but the way that I work is to go to a place that I suspect I'll have some interest in. And typically that comes out of a lot of different factors, ideas that I've shared with other artists and friends and writers. Has a lot to do with what I've read. So the literature of a particular place is an important starting point for me. People like A.B. Guthrie and Pete Dexter and Larry McMurtry, and in a more contemporary place, people like Rick Bass and Terry Tempest Williams, all of whom have written amazingly, both fiction and nonfiction, about the West. And so that informs ideas and creates, curiosities and mostly the motivation to go see things for myself. So, in terms of preconceptions, I try to have only the preconception that I'm going to see something that's interesting to me. And then I sort of sort it out after the fact. So the pictures that we're looking at right now, and the book itself, which has 74 pictures in it, the show I think has 20 some, those are really distilled from thousands, no exaggeration, of pictures that I've made over the years. And it's the patterns that I recognize retrospectively after I've made the photographs, when I'm back home in my darkroom in my studio and looking for things that resonate, pictures that resonate with one another, resonate with ideas that I have about the place, with experiences, and then as a sort of closed, almost like a closed circle, learning circle, the experience influences the photographs, which then influence what I know about the place, which then influences the next experience of being in the place, which is why I really try to photograph for years at a time in a particular place, rather than going once and thinking that I've seen it all, because it gets more complicated and nuanced the more that one does it.
Yeah, and that's an interesting way of working. I think there's, typically there's kind of a duality, two opposite sides of the way people work. There's an approach that you have where you kind of just go in head first and photograph madly, gather as much data, as much experience as you can, and process it later. And I think something that has, come to fruition more recently is going in with preconceived ideas, having your statement, having what you want in mind already thought of while going into taking pictures. And I think that, there's both can be extremes. And I think the happiest place is somewhere in the middle, but it seems like you're able to have initial interests, go in, and then be able to process it later. I think that, it's a realistic way of working as well, especially with your, condensed time frame each year, but then overall over the, years that you spend on projects, ideas come in, it allows ideas to come and pass.
Yeah, I mean, I think I used to be much more, in my younger days, more of a sort of evangelical or proselytizer about what the right way of working was. And frankly, I don't care anymore how other people work. Whatever works for them. But I do care about how I work, and I work in a very particular way and for particular reasons. And my sense is that I'm much more likely to find things that are resonant with myself, which is important, but also with other people, and that are fresh and that aren't just illustrations of preconceptions, if I go in not having many.
Mm-hmm.
I think that anybody who is a decent photographer and is smart enough can sort of fulfill an agenda that they have. I mean, this is so much happening, and the camera is really not, it's not the truth in the way that a lot of people think of it is. It's easily manipulatable, especially with the technology that we have. So if somebody has an agenda, for instance, let's say somebody felt like they wanted to illustrate an aspect of Western culture or city culture. Let's say somebody came from Montana and had this preconception that New York was a dangerous, unfriendly place. Believe me, there's plenty that they could find to illustrate that preconception. Yeah. But if they came to New York City without that preconception and just rather a rawness and a vulnerability to experience, they might actually learn something about the city that surprises them. That's how I like to travel wherever I go, whether it's out west or the south or anywhere. So my MO has always been to go in open-minded, and I would like to think that my photographs, that they transcend politics and that they transcend preconceptions and mythologies, even though all of that stuff obviously is tied up in and embedded in them. I'd like to think that the pictures go somewhat beyond that. And when somebody looks at these photographs that we're talking about and says, thank you, I hadn't been to these areas and I hadn't thought of the fact that that the people who might write off for various political reasons are actually struggling, hardworking, people with integrity and rituals and family lives, and that seems kind of shocking to me sometimes. But on the other hand, I get it. People are prejudiced, and that's certainly not how I want to work. And I try
think that,
to avoid it.
sorry, go on.
No, that's it. That's it.
Well, I think that, people's intent and mindset, and I think that's very detectable by people. You can kind of read that. And from seeing these pictures, you're allowed to get close, and people are vulnerable with you, which people would be maybe more standoffish if you had, come in with your Yankees hat thinking that you're better than everybody else and that you're here to, show the rest of the world what these people are really like. And I think that leads to questions of how did you gain access to these events and communities in the first place? I mean, they may not know where you are. They may have been, tight-knit communities. How did you gain access to these events and interact with them?
Yeah, they certainly are tight-knit communities, and I am certainly an outsider. On the other hand, that's not really how I think of myself. I mean, for one thing, after 10 or 12 or 15 years of pretty extensive travel in these areas, I know a lot about them geographically. I start to know something about them socially. And I'm also an American. And just because I live on the East Coast, I'd like to think that doesn't make me so provincial to the East Coast that I don't understand some of the particularities of the social culture in various other places in the country. So it's also worth noting that when I'm traveling, I try as hard as possible not to stick out, right? So I wouldn't say I'm exactly in incognito, but my wardrobe and the way that I look is really not a whole lot different from the average person in Montana. And I think that there's some advantage to that. And we can talk about people who don't have that advantage, but I can't speak to that personally because I am somebody who I think is easy. I can blend in. I can sort of camouflage with the people. So in terms of access, most of the places where I'm photographing people are public events, and that's part of the reason why I go to these public events, because they provide me with really good cover. Which is to say, there's a focus, there's a center of attention that is other than me, right? So if I'm walking down a street in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, and it's 104 degrees and everybody's in air conditioning except for the two people who are sitting on the corner fanning themselves, it's going to be very difficult for me to walk up to them and photograph them without them noticing. And that latter phrase is important because those are the only kinds of pictures that I'm interested in making myself. I really don't want the photograph to be about a reaction to the camera. So if I could be invisible or fly on the wall, I would be. And that's what these rodeos and fairs, et cetera, these events, that's what they provide me, is an opportunity to take advantage of the focus of attention being elsewhere. Now that said, I often get caught, but I'd like to think, and in fact, mostly it's the case, that when I do get caught, which is to say when somebody does realize that I'm photographing them or that they're in a photograph, they haven't reacted by the time that I've released the shutter. The reaction typically comes afterwards. And usually the reaction, I'd say 9 or maybe 90 something out of 100 times, people either are sort of don't really care or don't really react at all, or react with a kind of, I don't know, I read it as a tacit acknowledgement of a common space that we have between each other. That the act of photographing them is an acknowledgement. I'd like to think of it as an acknowledgement that they're important and that they're doing something interesting that I think is worthwhile. So I don't know. I think a lot of it has to do with how you carry yourself. I think, I remember when I first moved to New York City, I was a freshman, and I really moved to New York City to photograph on the streets, and that was in the late 80s, and things were pretty hard then on the streets, certainly harder than they have become in the meantime, the current period notwithstanding. But I remember somebody said to me, walk like an exclamation point, not a question mark. And that was really kind of profound advice, and I've given it to some of my own students, and that basically that means if you look vulnerable, you'll be treated in a vulnerable way. And I think that is not, that goes for almost every case, if you look like you're a threat, if you look like you're judgmental, if you look like you're photographing people in a kind of selfish, aggressive way, then people are going to treat you like that. They're going to feel like you're violating their space. And if you look like you're just a part of the furniture, if you will, and that you're ready to actually have a real conversation when somebody asks you why you're doing it, then I think that, you know, the benefit of the doubt is preserved, at least into that conversation. So I carry myself in a way where I'd like to think that the act of photographing people, even though I'm not asking them, and this can be a point of conversation for a lot of people, I'd like to think that what I'm doing is an act of respect.
In the pictures that we have here, there's kind of two energies that arise from the work. There's a sense of whimsy or free-spiritedness in the images that seem to take place at more of state fair and carnival-like venues. And then there's also a seriousness in the image that I have on the screen right now, and almost a reserved caution in the images that are geared more towards the rodeos that seem a little bit more cyclical, like they're repeated over generations. And do these environments coexist in the same gatherings, or are they separate? And I'm seeing that because they're weaved together through the sequencing of your work. You know, are these events and emotions captured? Are they separate events, or can all of these take place in one day or weekend, whatever the event may be?
If I'm right in reading that there are photographs where the subjects seem engaged in a serious and perhaps consequence-laden way, and others where they seem at play and more lighthearted, if that's what you're suggesting, then I get it. And what I would say is that happens everywhere. I mean, the thing by which I mean in all of the various events, it's not like there's one kind of event that more frequently than another creates a sense of anxiety in the kids or in the adults, or vice versa. I think that, you know, in the rodeos, and like this picture of the two boys with their chickens, it's a competition, and they want to win. And they're also, I mean, like these two kids are serious about wanting to win in some ways. Obviously, they're readable. And they've been, you know, not so much with the chickens, but especially with the larger animals, like the cows and the steers. You know, the kids have been working with these animals in some cases for several years, and this is their big day. This is the state fair 4-H competition, and there are judges, and then there are parents, there are their friends and their peers. So I don't know. I mean, the thing that it reminds me of in some ways is when I was, you know, when I was myself their age and a little bit older, I was a wrestler, and getting ready for a wrestling match is a particular kind of psychology. One has to get into a particular head. And, you know, it's different in terms of the physicality of it, but, you know, these kids have to mind their animals. They have to handle them in certain ways. So I think that there is an intensity that's associated with this becoming the penultimate moment. They've spent 3 years raising their animal. If they win, or if they get a particular kind of ribbon, that actually can make a big difference, especially with the steers and the cows, to a certain extent with the lambs and the chickens and the rabbits, et cetera. But especially with the steers and the cows, if they get a blue ribbon, you know, the next day at the auction, that can be a couple $1,000s, and that's a lot of money. So, and in terms of the whimsy or the lightheartedness, you know, I think that kids are kids, and they want to have a good time, and most of them, like all of us, want to be around their friends and their peers. And, you know, there's nothing like a summer afternoon turning into evening with the lights and the amusements and the community, and being 15, 16, 17, and with your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your best friends. I mean, it does kind of create an environment where, you know, they're still, I don't know if the word innocent is appropriate, but, you know, they can sort of forget about everything else, like the end of summer, for instance, and all of the symbolism therein. So, you know, I think it has to do with the pictures and what you're recognizing as heaviness or seriousness and playfulness or whimsy. I think that that's just a part of people's lives, and it's what I see. And so, you know, I try to edit the book, and, you know, I think we edited the exhibition in a way that blends those things together. So it's not all too much of one thing and all too much of another thing, because in fact, you know, I think it's actually representative of what's happening at these events. You know, it's a social cross section. It's a social event, and so it includes a variety of people's reactions to their society.
It seems like the rodeos are a rite of passage for these younger people, a place or an opportunity to pass down values, skills, or traditions from older generations in the community. And so how do these events function for the local communities? What role do they play besides just, an event that's going on that weekend?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And that's a thing that's very important to me that come across. I was at the Wyoming State Fair. I don't remember what year. I mean, I've been there many years, and the announcer said, almost as an answer to a question your question that I had in my head, he said, "We use livestock as a medium to grow good young people." And I thought that was kind of an amazing acknowledgement that this rite of passage, this ritual, was meant obviously to convey the kinds of things that you would expect it to convey, like a responsibility, a sense of connection to the land and to the animals that human beings put to their service, right? I mean, people compel horses and pigs and cows, et cetera, to serve them, to be food for them, to help them till the earth, et cetera. So I think that on one hand, the rodeos, for sure, the fairs, the 4-H fairs, it's a long ritual that is meant to instill certain values in the children who become adults, to pass on traditions, and that certainly is the case for the rodeo too. I think one of the things that's kind of amazing that you're picking up on, that's also amazing to me, is the youth of some of the kids. I mean, they have these tiny little, they look like little chairs or sleds in the shape of steer. So they have horns rather, and these sort of sleds. And these little kids with lassos, I mean, literally like 3-4 years old, are learning to throw, to rope cattle. And eventually there's a kind of like school, like sports. There are these kind of different levels that get more and more competitive and have greater consequences, to the point that they transition from being adolescents to being adults at the sort of penultimate events. So, my sort of more intellectualized read and thinking of this, and I've had interesting conversations with people out west who are actually living it, enough to be sensitive about how I describe it. But I've always found it remarkable, especially with the larger animals, like a steer, for instance, that let's say the young man or a young woman who is charged with the responsibility of raising this steer receives the animal as a calf, as a newborn animal, roughly when the kid is 13 or 14, and then over a period of a couple of years, they take care of this animal. In some cases, literally bottle feeding it if it's been rejected by its mother, which happens with some frequency, keeping it warm in the winter, checking it in the pasture, and this goes on to the point where the animal becomes large enough to be essentially entered into the 4-H competition and then sold at auction. And I find that process fascinating because of its timing. So 13, 14, 15 is the age of adolescence beginning to transition into adulthood. There are all these rituals that these kids are playing at when they're 10, 11, 12, sort of adult rituals that they're playing at, that the society has set up a version for them to try out. And then when they actually become 14, 15, 16, they're actually not playing anymore so much. It has consequences and it's real. And then, at the end of this whole cycle, if their steer wins, if it gets a blue ribbon, at the next day, there's an auction and the animals are auctioned off, and they're auctioned off to farms, and they're auctioned off to wherever, but also a lot of them are auctioned off to the slaughterhouse. And, so there's a certain irony to having won this contest, this ritualized contest, that coincides literally with your transition from adolescence to adulthood, i.e. some loss of innocence, and the sort of the termination of your relationship with this animal. Now, I had this conversation with a parent of a kid who was just the person I described, and Burley, Idaho. There's a picture in the book, the picture I'm talking about. And it was my last day, and the guy came up to me and he said, "So what you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I've been doing this for 3 decades. I photograph the fairs and the 4-H fairs and the rodeos, and that's usually and then we talk about the weather, and I say I'm from New York, which is usually very interestingly disarming because most of them think people from New York are idiots, which I can understand. So it's surprisingly disarming. But with this guy, I wanted to try out my idea. So I said, well, look, actually, maybe we can talk a little more about this. I said, I find it really interesting that, kids raise these animals through this critical period of their lives when they're becoming adults. And then at the very kind of moment that they are competing with the animal, that, that they no longer have the animal. And in some cases, the animal is actually going off to the abattoir. And he said, well, we don't have a sentimental relationship with our animals. And I thought that was a really interesting reaction, really interesting remark. And I mean, I know what he meant, and I would not say that he was wrong. It's his life. Who am I to judge? But I think actually what happens is that the kids, they do end up having a sentimental relationship with their animals. And the really important rite of passage is to find a way to compartmentalize that and move beyond it, because that's what life is going to be about. It's going to be about cultivation and then sacrifice and loss, and in a sort of ritualized, repeated way. Now, not that sounds pretty pessimistic, but I think that is what loss of innocence is, and the gaining of knowledge. And so I find that that's not what I'm thinking about necessarily when I'm out there making photographs. But when I come home and I put them together and I start to recognize the patterns and I see the way that the youth interact with the animals, it certainly is something that is a component in what I see.
We take parts of our lives and we associate them with our growth. And I think that it's hard to separate those two things, especially when you're younger. And I can see in the images how these don't seem like totally casual events. It seems like there's some weight to them, that they're, like you were talking about, there are tangible both rewards and consequences to people's participation, whether they win or lose. And like you were saying, sometimes if they win, the cattle or whatever it may be gets auctioned off to be slaughtered. I mean, even though it's a victory, it's hard to maybe explain to someone, or hard to process that that's a victory when something you've been so close to is no longer with you.
Yeah, well, it's a fact of life. So, but one of the other things that one has to be honest about is, there's less and less of a viable lifestyle associated with the thing that these kids are learning, right? I mean, with big agriculture and with the shattering of farming communities and small family farms, et cetera, there's really less and less opportunity for young people to actually survive as farmers and cowboys and, in animal husbandry or cattle, et cetera. And so that's also, I think, woven throughout these rodeos and fairs is, a real sense that the American landscape, as it relates to people and their relationship to animals and the land, is changing, has been changing for decades, but is changing really dramatically now and in the last, say, 20 years for various reasons, including climate change, et cetera. But also because, kids want to go to cities, or they want to go to college, or they want to move out of the Midwest or the plains, et cetera. And so I just think it's much more complicated, fraught, and there's a lot of vibrating layers of history, of mythology, of hopefulness, and of fear of the potential where what these people are doing that's been a way of life for 100+ years from generations of early European immigrants is no longer a viable lifestyle. And I think that that's part of what we're looking at too.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I wonder what in 2019, this recent year, this was the work that led to your Guggenheim Fellowship. And how has the work adapted since that fellowship? And relating back to what we were just talking about, what have the limitations of travel and COVID-19 placed on yourself as a photographer, but also for maybe the individuals or communities that are taking part of these events? I mean, it seems like they're key moments in the year for these people. And I wonder how that, if you know how that shifted, kind of with the limitations of what we're able to do now.
Yeah, I mean, look, everybody has experienced profound loss in the last 5 months on every imaginable level, from the death of people that we care about to the disruption of our own lifestyles, to the cancellation of events that give our lives, are sort of milestones of meaning in our lives. And we don't, I mean, this would be a much longer conversation, but the saddest thing, the most heartbreaking thing about the last 5 months is that it has really thrown into relief the disparity that exists in our culture between people who don't have a choice but to go to work, the so-called essential workers, and those who can avoid going to work. And the fact that that is so heavily based in class is, I think, a really profound problem and issue. It's not about photography. It's not about my photography. It's not in my photography necessarily. But I think, I haven't gone out west, and I really haven't traveled much yet, although I plan to next week, actually, for a few weeks. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I don't know what I'll see, but I know what I won't see. And that is that the events that are typically these gatherings of people that provide me the cover that I referred to before don't exist. So for me, the consequence is I don't have an obvious knowable place where I can find some of the things that I'm interested in photographing. But those consequences are irrelevant as far as I'm concerned, compared to the consequences that exist for the people who go there because they need to go there. They go there because that's where they see their friends and their family. They go there because that's how they stay sane, how they blow off a little bit of steam, how they get away from the farm, or how they get away from the hard work, etc. So I think, the consequences of my not being able to photograph the events that I might want to photograph under normal circumstances pale in comparison to the reality that it is depriving a lot of people of their livelihood, people who run the fairs, who work at the fairs. The kids' rite of passage. I don't know if you've been reading, but there's some 4-H competitions that are sort of happening online where the kids film their, somebody holds up a smartphone and does a video of the routine that they would normally be doing with their lamb in front of a judge. And so I think people have been pretty creative in replacing aspects of what has been canceled because of the pandemic. For me personally, there are a lot of different aspects to my work. In some ways, the most important is being out in the world and making the photographs. But then there's a lot of time and a lot of energy spent sorting them out, by which I mean processing the film, making the printing list, making the prints, living with the prints, editing the prints, recognizing patterns in them, and doing that for thousands and thousands of images over, at this point, 3 or 4 decades, a little over 3 decades. There's a lot that can be done in lockdown, so to speak.
Yes.
And I'm fortunate enough to have a darkroom in my house. And so in my apartment here in New York, for the first really 60 days, 50 some days, I was in the darkroom for almost 40. And I was able to work from home to run the press and to stay in touch with my staff and make sure we were doing what we needed to do. So, it caused anxiety for me, just like it did everybody. And I sort of sublimated that anxiety into working in the darkroom. So this has been a really productive time for me, while it's been frustrating to launch a new book into a world pandemic and to have an exhibition that was open for 3 days before it had to be closed. Those are pretty minor losses in the grand scheme of what others have lost. And I've just tried to make the most of what I have. I am planning to go on the road on Monday and to continue the work that I did with the Guggenheim Fellowship last year, which was to photograph New England in the ways that I have photographed almost every other part of the country for the last 30 years. Having been born in Boston and raised in Concord, Massachusetts, I'm a New Englander. And last year was the first time that I really paid attention to where I come from in the way that I paid attention to every place else. And it's had really exciting results that I have now seen as a result of having been in the darkroom on lockdown for the past several months. And it's really exciting to think that there are more things to pursue, and that I'm ready to go back out on the road. I have no expectations that my trip this summer for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, which is a little shorter than normal, is going to be anything like any other trip. But I've got to get out there to see it. And, I can sit here and imagine it as much as I want, but that's irrelevant until I get out and do the work, and we'll see what happens in the next few weeks.
Well, that's great. We really look forward to seeing that. And to reiterate for everybody else, the show is up through the 23rd of August, and feel free to visit, give us a call. You can make an appointment, and hopefully, people are able to see this work in whatever form it may be. I think regardless of that, people should check it out. So I know that you're getting prepared currently to head out for the road on Monday. So I'll let you go, and wanted to say thank you from myself and everyone here at the gallery for taking your time to do this. And we're excited to see the new pictures to come, and glad that we have your work up in the gallery now.
Thanks, Evan, and I appreciate your thoughtful questions. Makes a big difference.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter.
Okay. Yep. Take care. See you soon.
You as well. Bye-bye.